I was supposed to feel grown up the day I turned 18, the kind of birthday people talk about for years. But what I remember most is my mother standing in the hallway with her phone pressed to her chest and saying, "We are not doing anything tonight. Your sister cannot handle it." She did not say happy birthday first. She did not even look at my face when she said it. Behind her, my sister was already winding up for another tantrum, stomping and crying like the house belonged to her feelings. I stood there with my hands half wet from washing dishes, listening to my own milestone get erased like a smudge on a calendar. In that quiet moment, something in me went still. It was not just disappointment, it was recognition. I finally understood that in our family, my needs were not denied loudly. They were denied politely, efficiently, like canceling a dentist appointment. The memory still sits in my chest, even now, 10 years later, because it was the day I learned what my place really was. Not the birthday girl, not the daughter being celebrated. I was the invisible child, the one who made things easier for everyone else, and the moment I asked to be seen, I became an inconvenience. That afternoon had started with hope, which is what makes it sting. My mother had promised a small dinner, nothing fancy, a cake from the grocery store bakery, a few relatives, maybe my aunt bringing her potato salad, my grandma showing up early to straighten table settings the way she always did. I had even bought myself a cheap dress, navy blue, because I wanted to feel like someone who belonged at her own celebration. I got up early and cleaned the kitchen without being asked. I folded towels. I took out the trash. I did all the little things I always did, like my hands knew the choreography of keeping our house calm. My sister Brooke was already in a mood by noon. Brooke was 15 then, all sharp edges and big reactions. She had a way of filling a room without doing anything, just existing in it like a storm. She wanted a new phone, or maybe it was a tablet, something shiny and expensive. My mother said not right now, we will talk about it later, and that was enough to set Brooke off. At first it was the usual, the heavy sighs, the dramatic slamming of cabinet doors, the muttering just loud enough to be heard. I kept my head down and wiped the counter, pretending I did not notice. That was my part in the family drama. If I did not react, maybe it would pass faster. But Brooke did not want it to pass. She wanted a reaction. She wanted the whole house to swivel toward her. She started shouting from the living room, loud enough for the neighbors to hear if the windows were cracked. She threw a pillow, then a remote. Then she knocked over the little lamp on the side table, the one my mom had bought at a yard sale and always complained about, but never replaced. The lamp hit the carpet and made that dull thud, like a fist hitting a wall. My mother rushed in like she always did, voice soft, hands up, calm down, please, you are upsetting yourself. I stood in the doorway and watched, my fingers still sticky from a sponge full of dish soap. I wanted to say something. Not angry, not mean, just something like stop. Or this is not okay. Or it is my birthday. Can we not do this today? But the words lodged in my throat because I knew what would happen. My mother would glance at me with that look that said not now, and I would become the problem for making the problem worse. Brooke cried harder when she saw me watching. It was like my presence gave her a new fuel. She swung her head toward me and shouted that I always get what I want, that everyone loves me, that it is not fair. It was such a backwards lie I almost laughed, but nothing about it felt funny. My mother stepped between us, not like she was protecting me, but like she was blocking the view of me, like my existence was a spark near gasoline. She turned her face toward Brooke and said, "Sweetheart, we will handle this. Breathe with me. You know how to do it." Sweetheart. The word landed wrong. It always did. She used it on Brooke like a blanket, something warm and soft she could wrap around her. With me, my mother used words like responsible and mature and helpful, The words people use when they need you to keep being useful. I went back to the kitchen because it was easier than standing there feeling stupid. I dried my hands, rubbed them on my jeans, and tried to breathe through the ache building behind my ribs. I could hear Brooke's sobs through the wall. I could hear my mother's soothing voice, low and steady, the same tone she used when she talked to frightened dogs at the shelter. I could hear my father's footsteps upstairs, slow and heavy, like he was deciding whether to stay hidden or step in. My father did not step in. He almost never did. He worked long hours, and when he came home, he acted like the house was a hotel he had paid for, not a place he had any responsibility to emotionally manage. If my mother was a firefighter for Brooke's moods, my father was the man who walked past the smoke and pretended it was fog. I stared at the cake box on the counter, still sealed, the bakery logo bright and cheerful. I had peeked at it earlier. White frosting, pink flowers piped on top, a little plastic 18 stuck in the center. It felt almost embarrassing now, like a prop from a happier family's life. Around 4, my mother came into the kitchen. Her hair was falling out of its clip, her face flushed like she had run a mile. She looked at the cake box and pressed her lips together. For a second, I thought she might apologize. I thought she might say, "We will still do something, just you and me, even if it is small." Instead, she said, "We need to keep things low tonight." I tried to keep my voice even. Low, like what, exactly? She frowned like I was asking for too much detail. Like a quiet dinner, no company, no noise. My throat tightened. "We already invited people." She waved her hand, dismissing the inconvenience like it was paperwork. "I will call them. It is better this way." I stared at her, waiting for the part where she said happy birthday, waiting for the part where she looked guilty, waiting for anything that acknowledged I was a person standing in front of her, not a schedule she had to adjust. My mother glanced toward the hallway, toward Brooke's closed bedroom door, like she was listening for movement. Then she lowered her voice and said, "You know how she gets. We cannot trigger her tantrums with a big celebration." There it was. The sentence that cut. The sentence that told me, again, that Brooke's emotions were the ruler we measured all joy by. If Brooke was upset, nothing good could happen. If Brooke was fragile, everyone else had to become invisible. I swallowed hard. It is my birthday. My mother's eyes widened a little, not with tenderness, but with alarm, like my words were dangerous. She put her fingers to her temple and sighed, as if I had asked her to solve an impossible math problem. I know, honey. We will do something later. Right now, we have to keep the peace. Keep the peace." That phrase was a weapon in our house, and it always pointed at me. It meant be quiet. It meant be mature. It meant accept less, so someone else can have more. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "So we cancel," because she screamed. My mother's jaw tightened. "Do not say it like that." How should I say it? She looked like she might snap. Then she caught herself, took a breath, and softened her tone. She always softened for Brooke. She tried to soften for me when she wanted me to comply. She stepped closer and touched my arm, just a light pat, not a hug. "Please, do not make this harder. She needs tending to." I felt something inside me shift, a quiet click. Not anger that flared hot, but a colder kind of clarity. I realized my mother was not going to see what she was doing unless she was forced to. She was so deep in the pattern of favoritism that she thought it was parenting. She thought sacrificing one child for another was the only way to survive. I pulled my arm back gently. "I am going to my room." My mother exhaled like she was relieved I had not exploded. She nodded quickly. "Okay. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for understanding." The praise she gave me when I swallowed pain. In my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. I could hear my phone buzzing as my mother called relatives to cancel. I imagined her telling my aunt, "Brooke is having a hard day. We are keeping it quiet." I imagined my aunt saying, "Oh, poor Brooke," and not once asking how I felt. I imagined my grandma sighing and saying, "Well, you know how Brooke is." Like Brooke was a weather system we could not control. I wanted to cry, but I could not. The tears were stuck behind something harder. My stomach felt hollow and heavy at the same time, like I had swallowed a stone. I walked to my dresser and opened the top drawer. Socks, hair ties, a little pile of receipts. Underneath, my savings envelope, thin but real. Money from my part-time job at a hardware store in town. I worked evenings and weekends, mostly to get out of the house, but also because I liked the feeling of having something that was mine. I closed the drawer slowly. I sat back down. My hands rested on my knees like I was waiting for permission to exist. When I was younger, I used to believe if I was good enough, patient enough, helpful enough, my parents would notice. I thought my quietness was strength. I thought being low maintenance meant being loved. That night, on my 18th birthday, I finally understood the lie. Silence does not earn love in a toxic family. Silence just makes you easier to ignore. Around 6, my father knocked on my door. He did not come in right away, just stood in the hallway like he was unsure if he was allowed. "Hey, kiddo," he said. I turned my head. "Hi." He cleared his throat. "Your mom said we are doing a small dinner. Just us." I waited. Still. He was giving me information, not comfort. He scratched the back of his neck. "You doing okay?" I could have lied the way I always did. "Fine. No big deal." I could have kept the peace. I could have protected him from feeling guilty. That was another job I had, making my parents feel like good people even when they were failing me. Instead, I said, "Not really." My father looked startled, like he had not expected honesty. He shifted his weight. "Well, you know your sister." That was his whole answer. "You know your sister." Translation, accept it. I stared at him. "Does anybody know me?" He blinked. "Of course we do." "Then tell me one thing you planned for me today." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flicked away. I saw the truth in the movement. He had not planned anything. He had not even thought about it beyond the idea of it, beyond the word birthday on a calendar. He tried to recover. "We were going to. Your mom was going to do that dinner with your aunt and them. But with Brooke, you know." There it was again. Brooke's name, the excuse that covered everything. My father's face tightened like he was uncomfortable, not with what had happened, but with being confronted by it. He let out a slow breath. "Look, it has been a rough day." "For who?" I asked quietly. He looked at me, truly looked, and for a second I saw something like shame. But then his shoulders sagged, and he did what he always did when emotions got too real. He retreated. "We will do something another day," he said. "We will make it up to you." He reached for the doorframe as if he needed something to hold on to. Then he nodded once and walked away. I listened to his footsteps fade, and the quiet in the house felt different. It felt like a door closing. At dinner, my mother put plates on the table and acted like we were having a normal evening. She made spaghetti because it was easy, because it was something she could do without thinking. Brooke did not come out of her room. My mother carried a plate down the hall, knocked softly, and spoke in that soothing voice through the door. "Sweetheart, I brought you food. Please eat." My father sat at the table and scrolled on his phone. I twirled spaghetti on my fork and tasted nothing. My mother tried to fill the silence with practical talk, work schedules, errands, the weather, anything that did not require her to face the fact that she had just canceled my milestone birthday because my sister wanted a gadget. Halfway through the meal, my mother set her fork down and said, "We can do cake later, when Brooke is calm." I looked at her. Later, like tonight. She hesitated. "Maybe. We will see how she is." Something inside me wanted to scream, but I did not. I only nodded. I was so tired of pleading for basic recognition that even my anger felt exhausted. After dinner, I washed the dishes because nobody else moved. The water was too hot and my hands stung, but I welcomed the pain because it was simple. It made sense. Soap, water, plates, a mess you can fix. Unlike a family that only valued you when you were useful. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, asking how the birthday dinner was going. I stared at her message and did not know what to say. If I typed the truth, it would become real in a way I was not ready for. If I lied, I would be protecting the same system that was breaking me. I typed, "It got canceled," and then deleted it. I typed, "Family stuff," and deleted it too. Finally, I wrote, "Quiet night," and sent it, hating myself for shrinking my pain into one small word. Later, around 10, my mother knocked on my door again. She held the cake box like it was an offering. Her smile was cautious, like she was approaching an animal that might bite. "Brooke is asleep," she whispered. "We can do cake now, just us." I stared at the box. In another family, that might have been sweet. In our family, it felt like an afterthought, like she was trying to erase the guilt without changing the pattern. I forced myself to stand. "Okay." My mother carried the cake to the kitchen. She lit 2 skinny candles because she could not find the plastic 18. She smiled too brightly, the way people smile when they are pretending a moment is normal. "Happy birthday," she said softly. My father shuffled in, rubbing his eyes. He mumbled, "Happy birthday, kiddo." The candles flickered. I watched the flames tremble and thought about how easily they could be blown out by one strong breath, one tantrum, one mood. That was what my life felt like in that house. A small flame constantly at risk of being extinguished so someone else could stay comfortable. "Make a wish," my mother said. I looked at the candles and realized I did not want to wish for anything in that kitchen. Every wish I had ever made in that house had been a quiet plea to be loved fairly, and it had never worked. So I made a different kind of wish, one I did not say out loud. I wished for distance. I wished for a life where my birthday could not be canceled by someone else's screaming. I wished for the kind of revenge that did not require yelling or breaking things, just choosing myself. I blew out the candles. The smoke curled up in the air, thin and gray, and my mother clapped softly like she was trying to convince herself we had done enough. I smiled because that was what I did. I smiled to keep the peace. But when I went back to my room, I did not feel grateful. I felt empty. Then I felt calm in a way that scared me. I sat on my bed and looked around at the posters on my wall, the old stuffed animal on my shelf, the little childhood relics that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. I opened my closet and pulled down my backpack. I did not pack anything yet. I just held the straps in my hands and let the ideas settle. What would happen if the invisible pillar walked out? I could hear my mother laughing softly in the living room at something on television. I could hear my father's low voice responding. The house sounded peaceful, like nothing had happened. Like my birthday had not been erased and then awkwardly resurrected after my sister fell asleep. That was when I understood the truth, clear as glass. They believed the problem was over because Brooke was quiet. They believed the crisis had passed because the loudest person in the house had calmed down. Nobody had asked if I was okay. Nobody had asked what it cost me. I lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. I was not planning anything dramatic. I was not going to storm out and slam the door. I was not going to write a long speech or beg them to change. I had spent my whole life being the reasonable one, the one who made things smooth. That night, I decided I would use that same quietness for myself. And even before I took a single step, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When I finally left, it would not be my life that collapsed first. It would be theirs. The next morning felt like the house had amnesia. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin stripes across the hallway carpet, and everything looked exactly the same. Like my birthday had not been erased and then stitched back on in the dark like a cheap repair. My mother moved around the kitchen with that practiced efficiency she wore like armor. My father's work boots sat by the door, lined up the way I used to line them up when he kicked them off wherever. Somewhere down the hall, Brooke's music thumped softly through her bedroom wall, the kind of song with a heavy bass line that made the whole house vibrate as if her mood had its own weather system. I stood at the sink and rinsed a coffee mug that was not mine, because I could not think of what else to do with my hands. The hot water steamed against my fingers. I watched my reflection in the kitchen window, pale face, hair pulled up with a clip that was slightly crooked, eyes that looked older than they had the week before. I had turned 18, and the only thing that felt different was the way I could not unsee the pattern anymore. My mother glanced at me once while she scrambled eggs. Her eyes slid over me like she was scanning a grocery list. She did not say happy birthday again. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not even ask if I wanted breakfast. It was as if the quiet cake at 10 the night before had checked a box, and now we could all move on. Brooke came into the kitchen around 8, hair messy, hoodie hanging off one shoulder, and she opened the refrigerator with a dramatic sigh, like the cold air was personally insulting her. She pulled out orange juice and drank straight from the carton. My mother started to say something, then stopped, then redirected her energy into flipping eggs like the pan was the real problem. Brooke glanced at me. Her mouth twisted the way it always did when she wanted to start something but had not decided what. "You still mad?" she said, like she was asking if the weather was bad. I held my mug with both hands. "I am not mad." Brooke snorted and rolled her eyes, then turned to my mother. "Are we going to the mall today or not?" My mother's shoulders tightened. "We will see." Brooke slammed the carton down. "See? That is what you always say. You never mean it." My mother's voice softened instantly. "Honey, not this morning. Not this morning. Not this. Not now." Always the same rhythm. The house bent around Brooke's emotions, and everyone else learned to shift their weight so the floor would not creak. My father walked in, tie half knotted, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. He glanced at Brooke and then at my mother, then at me, and his eyes did what they always did when he sensed tension. They looked away. "Morning," he said, like he was clocking in. "Morning," my mother answered. Brooke muttered something under her breath. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Not fast, just steady and loud, like it was trying to remind me I was still here. I watched my mother slide eggs onto Brooke's plate first. I watched Brooke take a bite and grimace like the world had offended her again. I watched my father sip his coffee and scroll through emails. I watched myself stand there, the oldest child, the quiet child, the one who made everything run smoothly, and I realized something that made my stomach turn. It did not matter what happened to me, as long as the house stayed quiet. I left for school a little early even though it was senior year, and nobody cared if I showed up 5 minutes late. The cold air outside hit my cheeks and made my eyes water. I walked faster than I needed to, just to feel my body doing something besides holding still. The neighborhood was waking up, sprinklers clicking on, a dog barking behind a fence, Mrs. Patterson across the street waving without looking fully at my face, like she was waving at the idea of me. In the school hallway, someone I barely knew called out, "Hey," "Happy belated birthday," and I felt my throat tighten in a way it had not at home. Strangers could remember. My own family could not. I sat through classes with my mind floating somewhere above my desk. Teachers talked, my pen moved, but my thoughts kept circling the same truth. My mother had not woken up that morning thinking I needed comfort. She had woken up thinking Brooke needed managing. My father had woken up thinking he needed to get to work. And me, I had woken up and immediately started cleaning up little pieces of their lives like that was my job. It had always been my job, just nobody had ever called it that. When I got home that afternoon, the house was loud. Not in a joyful way, in a fractured way. Brooke was complaining about a teacher. My mother was trying to calm her down. My father was in the living room, TV on too loudly, as if he could drown out all of it. I dropped my backpack by the stairs and stood there for a second, just listening. The sound hit me like a familiar wave, and my body reacted before my brain did. I felt my shoulders tense. I felt my breath shallow. I felt that old instinct rise, the one that always told me, step in, smooth it out, make it better. That was when I heard my own voice in my head, quiet and clear. You do not have to. It felt almost rebellious to think it. My mother noticed me and flashed a quick smile that did not reach her eyes. Hey, sweetheart, can you help me with something in the kitchen? Of course she needed help. Of course she did. I was the one holding the strings that kept things from tangling. The responsible one, the mature one, the easy one. I walked into the kitchen and started chopping vegetables for dinner. My mother hovered, half listening to Brooke's rant from the next room. She kept saying, in that automatic way, like a metronome that kept the household tempo. Mom, I said softly, and my voice surprised me because it sounded steadier than I felt. Can we talk? My mother turned her head, eyebrows lifting, cautious. About what? About last night. Her mouth tightened. I thought we handled that. Handled it. Like it was a broken appliance. I kept my eyes on the cutting board. It hurt, Mom. My mother exhaled slowly. Claire, I know it was not ideal, but you saw how Brooke was. What did you want me to do? There it was, the trap disguised as a question. If I answered honestly, I would sound selfish. If I stayed quiet, I would disappear again. I wanted you to care, I said. I wanted you to say happy birthday before you canceled it. I wanted you to look at me. My mother's eyes flicked toward the living room again, like she was listening for Brooke's footsteps. She lowered her voice. You know I love you. I nodded because I did not have the energy to argue about love. Love was not the problem. Love was a word people used when they did not want to talk about fairness. My mother reached for my hand, squeezed it once, quick and small. You are strong, she said. You always have been. Brooke is, sensitive. We have to handle her differently. Strong, sensitive, the labels. They had shaped my entire childhood like grooves in a record, and the music was always the same. Brooke's feelings were fragile, so everyone protected them. My feelings were assumed to be sturdy, so everyone stepped on them. I pulled my hand back and went back to chopping. My mother watched me for a second, then turned away, relieved that I was not making a bigger scene. And that was the exact moment I realized this was not going to change with one conversation. My mother did not hear me. She filed my hurt away as an inconvenience, something she would make up for later, like she always promised. Later never came. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the same ceiling I had stared at on my birthday, and I started doing something I had never allowed myself to do before. I started replaying memories, not as isolated accidents, but as evidence. The first one that came to me was from when I was 9. I could still see the living room, the old brown couch with the scratchy fabric, the faded rug. My grandmother had mailed a little package for me, a set of colored pencils in a metal tin. I had wanted them so badly because I loved drawing then. Loved the way I could create a world on paper where nobody shouted and nobody needed tending to. Brooke was 6, and she watched me open the tin like it was hers. Her face crumpled. She started crying, loud and sharp, and my mother rushed in, asking what happened. Brooke pointed at the pencils and sobbed that it was not fair. She wanted them. She needed them. My mother looked at me with that look, the look that asked me to sacrifice before she even spoke. "Claire," she said gently, "you do not mind sharing, do you? You can be the big sister." I remember the pride I felt, because I thought being the big sister meant being chosen. I slid the tin across the coffee table toward Brooke and said she could have them first. Brooke stopped crying instantly. She smiled through wet cheeks and hugged my mother. My mother stroked her hair and said, "See, you are okay now." Then she turned to me and said, "Thank you for being so mature. Thank you. Not you deserve your own gift. Not I will get you another. Just thank you. Like my sacrifice was payment to keep the peace." I remember going to my room afterward and drawing with a dull pencil I had found in a junk drawer. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was good. I told myself love meant giving. For years, I believed that. Another memory surfaced from middle school. I had made the honor roll. It was not a big deal to anyone else, but it was a big deal to me. I had worked hard, stayed up late, stayed quiet in the chaos, studied in the laundry room sometimes because it was the only place with a door that could close. The school sent home a certificate and a letter. I brought it to my mother, heart pounding, and she glanced at it and smiled. "That is wonderful, honey," she said. And then Brooke walked in crying because she had not been invited to a friend's birthday party. My mother's attention snapped toward Brooke like a magnet. She hugged her and started talking about how kids could be mean, how Brooke was special, how everyone else was wrong. I stood there holding my certificate, the paper bending slightly in my hands. My mother looked back at me over Brooke's shoulder and said, "Can we talk about that later? I need to deal with this first." Later never came. It was not just the big things or the birthdays. It was the way my life was treated like background noise. It was the way my silence was taken as proof I did not need anything. It was the way I had been trained to believe that wanting to be seen was selfish. The last memory that hit me was from the summer before high school. I had finally spoken up. It was a small moment, but it felt huge. Brooke had thrown a fit because she wanted to go to the pool and my parents had said no. She screamed, she cried, she kicked the back of my father's seat in the car, and my mother turned around and said, "Fine, fine, we will go. Just stop." Something snapped in me then. Not rage, just exhaustion. I said, "Why do we always do what she wants? Why does she get to act like this?" My mother's face went still. My father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Brooke looked at me like I had betrayed her. My mother did not yell. She did something worse. She sounded disappointed, like I had failed a test. "Claire," she said, "you know she struggles. Do not be cruel." Cruel. That was the word she used for me, for asking for fairness. Brooke started sobbing again, louder, and my mother turned fully toward her, rubbing her arm, whispering comfort. My father said nothing. The car felt tight, like there was no oxygen left. Then my mother said, quietly but firmly, "This is why we do not talk like that. You upset her, and now she is spiraling. Do you want that?" It was not a question. It was a lesson. If I spoke, Brooke would fall apart, and it would be my fault. The family's peace depended on my silence. After that, I stopped speaking up. I became better at swallowing things. I became the girl who could take it, the girl who was easy, the girl who did not need much. I lay there in bed, watching those memories stack like bricks. and I felt something inside me change shape. My pain was no longer a blurry ache. It was a clear pattern, a system, a kind of favoritism so normalized it had been mistaken for love. And that was the part I was never supposed to notice. The next day, I tested it without meaning to. It started with something small. My father left for work and forgot his lunch. Normally, I would have noticed. I was the one who packed it half the time when my mother was distracted, the one who reminded him his keys were on the counter, the one who kept track of everyone's little needs like an unpaid assistant. This time, I did not chase him out to the driveway. I watched through the window as he backed out, and I stayed still. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Did your dad take his lunch?" I stared at the screen. A simple question, but it carried an assumption that I would know, that I had been responsible, that if something was missing, I would fix it. I typed, "I do not know," and then I deleted it. I set the phone down and went to school. When I came home, my father was irritated. He opened the fridge and slammed it shut. "No lunch today," he muttered. My mother apologized quickly. I must have forgotten. She did not look at me, but I felt the blame flicker in the air anyway, like a ghost. The house always wanted a reason, and if Brooke was too fragile to blame, and my mother was too stressed, and my father was too tired, the blame had only one place to land. Me. I went upstairs and closed my door and leaned my back against it. My heart beat steady. I was not scared. I was not even sad in the way I had been on my birthday. I was curious. That was a dangerous feeling, because curiosity meant I was no longer simply enduring. Curiosity meant I was watching, measuring, learning. What actually happens, I thought, if I stop compensating? It was the first time I let myself ask it without flinching. Downstairs, Brooke started complaining about dinner, about school, about life. My mother soothed. My father sighed. The house moved in its familiar loop. But I stayed upstairs, hands in my lap, listening, and for the first time, I did not feel like I had to run down there and hold the walls up. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the calendar app. There, on yesterday's date, was the reminder I had set weeks earlier. Claire, 18th birthday, dinner at 6, cake at 8. The words looked absurd now, like a plan someone else had made for a different family. I pressed my thumb to the screen and deleted the reminder. Then I opened my dresser and looked at the envelope of savings again. I did not take it out. I just looked at it, as if acknowledging it made it more real. Outside my room, the hallway creaked as someone walked past. My mother paused at my door, her shadow crossing the crack of light under it. I held my breath without meaning to. I still had that old instinct, the one that said, "If you make too much noise, you will cause trouble." My mother did not knock. She moved on. I let my breath out slowly. A small, strange relief washed over me. They did not even notice I was holding my life together with my silence. And if they did not notice, then they would never thank me for it. They would never change out of gratitude. The only way they would ever see it was if it disappeared. I sat on my bed and stared at my hands, at the faint soap dryness from washing dishes, at the small callus on my finger from gripping a pencil all those nights in the laundry room. I thought about my birthday candles, how easily the flames had gone out. I thought about the smoke curling up afterward, like proof something had burned and then vanished. A knock came at my door then, light but impatient. Brooke's voice followed, sharp as a pin. "Claire, where is my charger?" "I left it on the kitchen counter and it is not there." I almost laughed, because of course she assumed I would know. Of course she assumed the house would keep functioning the way it always had, with me quietly fixing the gaps. I stared at the door, my pulse calm, my voice steady when I answered. "I do not know." There was a pause. like she could not compute the idea that I would not rush to help. Brooke huffed. "Whatever," she snapped, and her footsteps stomped away. I stayed sitting on my bed, and in that stillness, I felt it. The first tiny shift in the floorboards of our family. Not a collapse, not yet, just the beginning of a crack. I looked down at my phone again. Another message had come in. This one from my mother. "Can you please come down and help me with dinner? Brooke is in a mood." I stared at the words. Please. Help. Brooke is in a mood. Not how are you? Not, I am sorry. Not, can we talk? Just the usual expectation wrapped in polite language. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment, I could almost feel my body moving on its own, like it always did. Going downstairs, stirring the sauce, calming the air, saving the evening. Instead, I set the phone face down on the bed, and I sat there, listening to the house struggle without me, just enough to make one thing certain in my bones. If my absence could create even a small crack this quickly, then the truth was bigger than I had ever admitted. And I was finally ready to find out how far it would spread. The days after that passed in a strange, colorless blur, like the house had been wrapped in cotton. Nothing exploded. Nothing got fixed either. Everyone moved through their routines with the same practiced motions, and it was that sameness that finally pushed something inside me from awareness into resolve. On the surface, everything looked fine. My mother woke up early and made breakfast. My father went to work and came home tired. Brooke complained about school, about friends, about how unfair the world was to her. The house still bent around her moods, still softened its edges so she would not bruise herself on reality. And me, I was still there, walking the same hallways, sleeping in the same room, breathing the same air. But something had changed, and I could feel it in my body before I could explain it in words. I was tired in a deeper way than exhaustion. I slept, but did not feel rested. I ate because food was there, not because I was hungry. My chest felt tight, like I was carrying a weight that did not belong to me anymore, but had not yet been set down. My mother acted especially cheerful those days, like she sensed something fragile and was trying to smooth it over with normalcy. She asked me about school. She reminded me about chores. She thanked me more often, small thank yous tossed out like coins, as if gratitude could replace accountability. "Thank you for folding the laundry. Thank you for helping with dinner. Thank you for being patient." Every thank you landed wrong. They were all payment for silence. Brooke, on the other hand, seemed relieved. With my birthday behind us, with no confrontation lingering in the air, she settled back into her usual rhythm. She sprawled across the couch, monopolized the television, complained loudly when dinner was not what she wanted. She barely looked at me, except when she needed something. "Claire, where is my hoodie? Claire, can you tell Mom I want tacos tonight? Claire, my charger is missing again." Each time, I answered shorter than before. Sometimes I did not answer at all. Brooke noticed, but only enough to be annoyed, not enough to be curious. My father stayed distant, which was his version of peace. He liked things quiet, predictable. As long as nobody cried too loudly, he considered the household functional. When my mother and Brooke argued, he disappeared into the garage or turned the television up. When my mother sighed heavily and glanced my way, he did not see it. The strangest part was how nobody asked me how I was doing, not once, not after the canceled birthday, not after the awkward cake, not after I started pulling back. It was as if my silence had trained them not to worry about me. One afternoon, a few days later, I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Brooke stormed in, backpack slung over one shoulder. She threw it on the floor and crossed her arms. "Mom said we are not going to the mall this weekend because she has errands." She glared at me like it was my fault. "You always get your way." I looked up slowly. I do not get my way. Brooke scoffed. Please. You are the favorite. The word hit me harder than I expected. Favorite. It was so far from my reality that it almost made me laugh. In what world? I asked quietly. She rolled her eyes. You never get in trouble. Mom always listens to you. I closed my notebook and folded my hands on top of it, grounding myself. Mom listens to me because I do not scream. Brooke's face twisted. So what? I should scream more. You already do. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, and my mother rushed in from the laundry room like she had been waiting behind the wall. What is going on? She asked quickly. Nothing, Brooke said, but her voice was sharp. Claire is being annoying. My mother turned to me. Claire, do not provoke her. I stared at my mother. I had not raised my voice. I had not insulted Brooke. I had simply spoken. I am not provoking anyone, I said. My mother sighed, the sound heavy with warning. You know she is sensitive. There it was again. The same excuse, the same dismissal, the same expectation that I would back down. Something in me went very still. I gathered my books and stood up. I am going to my room. My mother frowned. You do not have to walk away like that. I did not respond. I walked upstairs, closed my door, and leaned my forehead against it. My hands were shaking, not with anger, but with the effort of not giving in. In my room, the walls felt closer than they ever had. This space had once been my refuge, my quiet place, but now it felt like a holding cell. I sat on my bed and stared at the floor, my thoughts circling one realization. Nothing was going to change because nothing ever had. That was when clarity finally hardened into something solid. It was not going to happen in one conversation. It was not going to happen because my mother suddenly understood. It was not going to happen because my father found his spine. It was not going to happen because Brooke matured overnight. This system worked exactly as it was designed to work, and it worked at my expense. The thought did not come with fireworks or rage. It came with a calm that scared me more than anger ever had. I started noticing the cost of staying in ways I had never allowed myself to notice before. How my shoulders stayed tense even when I was alone. How I flinched at raised voices, even when they were not directed at me. How my mind was always half occupied with monitoring the emotional temperature of the house. I was not living there. I was managing it. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds, my father coughing softly in the bathroom, my mother moving dishes in the sink, Brooke laughing at something on her phone. The house breathed, and I breathed with it, like I always had, matching my rhythm to everyone else's. Around 2 a.m, I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The room was dark except for the glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. I stood there for a long moment, then walked quietly to my dresser. I opened the top drawer and took out the envelope of savings. It was not much, but it was mine. Money I had earned, hour by hour, stocking shelves and helping customers find screws and paint colors. Money that represented time I had spent outside this house. I did not count it. I did not need to. I just held it in my hands and felt its weight. Then I opened my closet and pulled out my backpack. The one I used for school. Sturdy, practical. I set it on the bed and unzipped it. I did not pack anything yet. I just sat there, looking at the open bag, letting the idea breathe. The rules formed in my mind slowly, not like commands, but like boundaries I had never allowed myself to draw. No announcements, no warnings, no dramatic speeches, no threats. I knew my family. I knew how they operated. If I made noise, they would focus on controlling the noise, not understanding the reason. If I cried, they would soothe me just enough to keep things stable. If I threatened to leave, they would promise change. Not because they meant it, but because they needed the system to stay intact. If I wanted to know the truth, I had to leave quietly. The power was not in forcing them to listen. The power was in removing what they took for granted. Over the next few days, I began to prepare without letting it show. I sorted through my belongings mentally before touching anything. What did I actually need? What was just history? I gathered important documents when no one was looking. Birth certificate, social security card. I slid them into a folder and tucked it deep into my backpack. I added a few changes of clothes, rolled tightly so they would not take up space. Toiletries, my phone charger, the savings envelope. Each item felt like a small rebellion. At the same time, I began doing less, not dramatically, just enough to test the system. I stopped reminding my father about his keys. I stopped refilling the soap dispenser in the bathroom. I stopped checking the calendar to make sure everyone was where they needed to be. The house did not collapse, but it did stumble. My father was late one morning because he could not find his wallet. My mother burned dinner because she was distracted by Brooke's complaints. Brooke lost it when she realized her favorite shirt was still in the dryer from the night before. "Why is nothing ready?" she shouted. My mother snapped back. "I am doing my best." I watched from the hallway, my heart pounding, my instinct screaming at me to step in, to calm things down, to fix it. I did not. That was the hardest part. Not the packing, not the planning. It was the restraint. Every fiber of my upbringing told me that if the house was in chaos, it was my responsibility to restore order. Letting things unravel felt like standing still while something precious broke. But then another thought came, quieter but stronger. If the system cannot function without me sacrificing myself, then it deserves to be exposed. One evening, my mother knocked on my door. Her knock was gentle, but there was an edge to it, impatience disguised as politeness. "Claire, can you help me with Brooke? She is spiraling again." I sat on my bed, my backpack hidden in the closet behind hanging coats. My heart beat hard, but my voice stayed calm. "I am tired, Mom." She frowned. "Just for a minute." I hesitated. This was the moment, the test. If I gave in now, nothing would change. I shook my head slowly. "I cannot tonight." My mother stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked down the hallway toward Brooke's room, then back at me. "Fine," she said sharply. "I will handle it." She turned and walked away. I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, my pulse racing. Guilt flooded me, hot and sharp. I imagined Brooke crying harder. I imagined my mother overwhelmed. I imagined my father sighing, wishing things were easier. Then I imagined another version of myself, 10 years older, still in this room, still managing everyone else's emotions, still invisible. The guilt faded. The resolve remained. That night, fear crept in. Real fear. The kind that whispers worst-case scenarios. They will say you are selfish. They will tell everyone you abandoned them. They will make you the villain. I knew that was coming. I could already hear the words in my mother's voice, in Brooke's sarcasm. I could already see the way the story would be rewritten. But another truth rose up, steady and undeniable. Being misunderstood was not worse than disappearing. The night before I planned to leave, I barely slept. I lay there listening to the house one last time, memorizing its sounds like a song I was finally ready to stop humming along to. I walked through my room slowly, touching the desk, the window, the door frame, not with nostalgia, but with acknowledgement. This place had shaped me. It had taught me how to endure, but endurance was no longer enough. I dressed quietly before dawn, jeans and a sweater, my movements careful and deliberate. I slipped my backpack on and stood in the middle of my room, the weight of it grounding me. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. I felt sad. I felt guilty. But underneath all of that, there was something new: certainty. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The house was still. Everyone was asleep. I took one last look down the hall toward my parents' room, toward Brooke's room, toward the life I had been living. Then I turned toward the stairs. The decision was made. The only thing left was to take the step that would change everything. The front door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet morning. The sky was still gray, that color it gets right before sunrise when the world feels unfinished. I stood on the porch for a second with my backpack pulling at my shoulders, my breath visible in the cold air, half expecting the door to open again, half hoping it would not. It did not. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, my sneakers making a faint scuffing sound I had never noticed before. The street was empty. No cars, no voices, just the hum of a distant highway and the occasional bird calling like it did not know what time it was yet. My hands were shaking, but my steps were steady, like my body had already decided what my mind was still catching up to. I had imagined this moment so many times over the past few days. Imagined guilt crashing into me like a wave. Imagined myself turning back, knocking on the door, apologizing for something I could not even name. Instead, what I felt was a strange, almost unsettling calm. My chest did not ache the way it usually did in that house. My shoulders were not tight. I was scared, yes, but it was a clean fear, not the suffocating kind I had lived with for years. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the block, the same one I had waited at countless times for school, for work, for rides that took me away and then brought me back again. This time, I did not know when I would be back. That thought sat quietly beside me instead of screaming. When the bus came, I climbed on and paid my fare, the driver barely glancing at me. I took a seat near the back and pressed my forehead lightly against the cool window. Houses slid past, familiar roofs and driveways blurring together, and with each one, the feeling that I had stepped out of something solid grew stronger. I got off near my grandmother's neighborhood, a place that always felt a little slower, a little softer around the edges. The streets were narrower, the trees older. I walked the last few blocks with the sun finally rising behind me, painting everything gold in a way that felt almost intentional. My grandmother's house sat at the corner like it always had, white siding, green shutters, the small porch with the rocking chair that creaked when you leaned back too far. I stood there for a second before knocking, suddenly aware of how final this felt. Then I knocked softly, twice. My grandmother opened the door in her robe, her hair pulled back loosely, eyes widening when she saw me standing there with a backpack. "Claire," she said, her voice thick with surprise. "What are you doing here so early?" I swallowed. "Can I come in?" She stepped aside immediately, no questions, no hesitation. "Of course you can." The warmth of the house wrapped around me as soon as I stepped inside. The smell of coffee, the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet. My grandmother closed the door behind me and turned, studying my face. "You look tired," she said gently. I nodded. "I am?" She did not press. She never did. She put a hand on my back and guided me toward the kitchen table, already pulling out a chair. "Sit. I will make you something." As she moved around the kitchen, the normalcy of it all nearly broke me. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, took out 2 mugs. No rush, no tension, no one tiptoeing around someone else's emotions. When she sat across from me with a mug of tea, she finally spoke again. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "Whatever is going on, we will figure it out later." The words landed heavy and comforting at the same time. I wrapped my hands around the mug and felt the warmth seep into my fingers. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You do not need to thank me for that." After a while, she got up to get ready for the day, and I was left alone at the table, staring out the window at the quiet street. My phone sat on the table beside me, dark and silent. I did not know what I expected. A flood of messages, missed calls, panic. Nothing happened. The morning passed slowly. I showered, changed into clean clothes, folded my backpack away in the spare room. My grandmother moved through her routines, humming softly, watering her plants, watching the morning news at a low volume. She did not ask questions. She did not hover. She gave me space in the most generous way possible. Around noon, I checked my phone again. Still nothing. No calls, no texts, no frantic messages asking where I was. It was as if my absence had not registered at all. That realization hit me harder than any confrontation could have. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone, my chest tightening not with fear, but with a dull ache of recognition. They did not notice. Of course they did not. In their minds, I was probably in my room, or at school, or at work. I was always somewhere in the background, always available, always expected to reappear when needed. I went back to the kitchen and helped my grandmother prepare lunch, chopping vegetables, stirring soup, doing things with my hands that felt grounding. She chatted about the weather, about a neighbor's new dog, about nothing in particular. The simplicity of it made my eyes sting. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk around the neighborhood, my phone tucked into my pocket. Each step felt lighter than the last, like my body was finally learning a new rhythm. I breathed deeply, noticing the way my lungs filled without that familiar tightness. When I got back to the house, my phone buzzed for the first time. It was a text from my mother. "Have you seen Brooke's charger?" I stared at the words, my mouth falling open slightly. Not "where are you?" Not "are you okay?" Not "why did you leave?" Just an assumption, dropped casually into my absence. I did not respond. I set the phone face down on the table and went back to helping my grandmother with the dishes. The sound of the water running, the clink of plates, the ordinary comfort of it all made my hands steady again. That evening, my grandfather came home from his volunteer shift and raised his eyebrows when he saw me. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, smiling. "You staying a while?" I nodded. "If that is okay." He chuckled softly. "It is always okay." Dinner was quiet and easy. We talked about my classes, about his garden plans, about a movie my grandmother wanted to watch later. No one interrupted. No one demanded attention. I ate until I was full without feeling rushed. When I went to bed that night in the spare room, I lay there listening to a different kind of silence. Not the tense silence of my parents' house, where every quiet moment felt like it could snap. This silence was wide and calm. It held me instead of pressing down on me. I slept deeper than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of coffee drifting down the hall. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then it came back to me, not with panic, but with relief. I checked my phone. 2 missed calls from my mother, 1 from my father. A text from Brooke that read, "Did you take my black sweater?" Still nothing that sounded like concern. My mother's texts followed shortly after. "Where are you? Why are you not answering? This is not funny." I felt a familiar pull in my chest, that instinct to explain, to smooth things over, to make sure everyone was okay. I recognized it now for what it was. Conditioning. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I wrote, "I am safe. I need some space. I sent it and immediately turned my phone face down again, my heart racing. The house did not explode. The world did not end. I did not collapse into guilt the way I had always feared I would. The day passed. I helped my grandmother with errands. I sat at the dining table and worked on homework. I laughed at something my grandfather said and felt the sound come from a place that was not guarded. By evening, more messages had come in. You cannot just disappear like this. Your sister is upset. You need to come home and talk about this. Need. The word hung there, heavy with expectation. They still did not miss me. They needed me. I stared at the messages for a long time, my emotions tangling in ways that were new and uncomfortable. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand apologies, to list every moment I had been overlooked. Another part of me wanted to run back and fix everything, to restore the fragile balance I had always maintained. I did neither. I went outside and sat on the porch steps, watching the sky darken. The air was cool against my skin, and the stars began to appear one by one. I felt small in a way that was not diminishing, but humbling. From this distance, I could see my family more clearly than I ever had from inside that house. I could see how quickly they moved from indifference to irritation, from irritation to need. I could see how little space there was in their reactions for reflection or accountability. I realized then that my leaving had not created chaos yet. Not really. What it had created was confusion. They assumed I would come back. They assumed I always would. I held my phone in my hand, feeling its weight, the connection it represented, and made a quiet promise to myself. I would not rush. I would not fill the silence just to make them comfortable. I would let the absence speak for itself. Inside the house, my grandparents laughed at something on television, the sound drifting out through the open window. I leaned back against the porch railing and closed my eyes, breathing in the night air. For the first time, my absence was real, and somewhere, far away from this quiet street, the house I had left behind was beginning to notice that something essential was missing, even if they did not yet understand what it was. I stayed there on the porch as the stars settled into place, knowing the next messages would not sound the same, and that when they finally did reach for me again, it would not be out of habit, but out of necessity. The third morning away from home arrived with a feeling I could not name yet. Something subtle and off, like the air before a storm. I woke up early in my grandparents' spare room, sunlight brushing the edge of the curtains, and for a moment I lay still, listening. No raised voices, no doors slamming, no sharp intake of breath that meant Brooke was about to explode. Just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and my grandfather coughing softly as he read the paper. I sat up and realized my shoulders were not tight. That was when I knew something had shifted, not just inside me, but around me. Distance had done what years of patience never had. It had given me perspective. My phone lay on the nightstand where I had left it, face down. I did not reach for it right away. I brushed my hair, pulled on a sweater, and went downstairs to help my grandmother with breakfast. She was already at the counter, slicing fruit with careful hands, humming a tune from a time before I was born. "You sleep okay?" she asked without looking up. I nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile that did not pry. That was her gift. She let silence be useful. We ate together, and afterward I stepped outside with my coffee, sitting on the back steps where the sun warmed the wood. The neighborhood was quiet, just the sound of sprinklers and a lawnmower somewhere far off. I breathed in deeply, and for the first time in days, I let myself check my phone. There were new messages. Not panicked yet, but sharper than before. "Where are you staying? This has gone far enough. You are making things difficult for everyone. Difficult. Not worried. Not scared." difficult. I felt a flicker of something in my chest, not guilt this time, but recognition. The language had changed. I was no longer invisible. I was inconvenient. I did not reply. I set the phone back down and watched a pair of birds hop across the fence, their movements quick and careless. I wondered how long it would take before inconvenience turned into urgency. It did not take long. Later that morning, I went into town to run an errand for my grandmother. The hardware store sat on the corner near the bakery, the same place I had worked part-time for over a year. As I walked past, the familiar smell of sawdust and paint drifted out, and I felt a strange sense of comfort. This place had always been mine, separate from the chaos of home. I stepped inside to grab a few things, and before I even reached the aisle, I heard my name. Claire. It was Mrs. Donnelly, our neighbor from 2 houses down, standing near the counter with a basket of light bulbs. She looked at me like she had been waiting. "There you are," she said. "Your mother has been beside herself." I froze just long enough to register the shift. Not my mother is worried. Not she misses you. Beside herself. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Mrs. Donnelly leaned in, lowering her voice like we were sharing a secret. Well, I probably should not be saying anything, but she asked me if I had seen you. Said things have been a mess over there. Your sister has been acting out. More than usual. Screaming. Throwing things. Your dad left early this morning with a bag. I do not think he came back last night. The words hit in quick succession, each one landing heavier than the last. My stomach dropped, not with shock, but with confirmation. I nodded slowly. "I am okay." Mrs. Donnelly studied my face. "You look calm," she said. Then she sighed. "Honestly, maybe this is what needed to happen. Your mother always leaned on you so much. Everyone could see it. Could they? Or had they just benefited from it?" I thanked her and finished my errand, my hands steady even as my thoughts raced. Outside, the sky had darkened slightly, clouds gathering without threatening rain yet. I walked back toward my grandparents' house, replaying her words. "Things have been a mess. Your sister has been acting out. Your dad left with a bag." The invisible glue had been removed, and the structure was already wobbling. At home, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my father. "Where are you? Your mother is overwhelmed. We need to talk. Need." There it was again. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen. The old instinct surged up fast and familiar. Go back. Fix it. Smooth it out. Be the bridge between everyone's tempers and tears. I pictured my mother's face when Brooke screamed, the way she looked at me like I was a spare set of hands meant to help hold everything together. I pictured my father's silence, the way he always waited for the storm to pass without stepping into it. I typed a response, erased it, typed another. Finally, I wrote, "I am safe. I am staying with Grandma and Grandpa. I am not coming back right now." I pressed send before I could talk myself out of it. The reply came faster than I expected. "This is not the time to make a point. Your sister is spiraling. Your dad and I are arguing nonstop. We need you here. Not we miss you. Not we are sorry. We need you." I let the phone fall face down on the table and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My chest felt tight, but my hands were steady. That difference mattered. That afternoon, my grandmother noticed I was quiet. She did not ask questions, but she sat with me in the living room while my grandfather worked in the yard. The television played softly, a rerun of some old show, and she knitted with practiced ease. "Your mother called earlier," she said after a while. I looked at her. "What did she say?" "She asked if you were here. I told her you were safe. She wanted me to convince you to come home." My grandmother's needles clicked together. I told her I would not do that. Relief washed through me so strong it made my eyes sting. Thank you. She looked at me then. Really looked. You have spent a long time holding things together that were not your responsibility. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people feel the weight they have been avoiding. Her words echoed something I had been circling around in my own mind. This was not cruelty. It was exposure. That evening, the messages intensified. Your sister is skipping school. She threw a glass at the wall. The neighbors are starting to notice. This is getting serious. I read each one slowly, the details painting a picture of a house unraveling without me. The old me would have panicked, would have jumped up and started planning how to put everything back in order. Instead, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. I typed back one sentence. I am not coming home to fix things. Then I turned my phone off. The next day, the cracks widened. I turned my phone back on in the afternoon and was met with a flood of missed calls. My mother, my father, Brooke, even an aunt I barely spoke to. There was a voicemail from my sister. So you just ran away because you did not get your stupid party. Are you seriously that dramatic? You are ruining everything. Mom is crying all the time because of you. I listened to it twice, then laughed softly, a short, bitter sound that surprised me. Dramatic. Coming from the girl whose tantrum had canceled my birthday, whose emotions had ruled our household for years. I did not reply. I saved the voicemail. Another message came in from my mother, longer than the others. You are being selfish. We have done everything for you. Your sister has issues, you know that. She cannot handle this kind of stress. If something happens to her, how will you live with yourself? There it was. The guilt weaponized. The old chain they had always wrapped around my neck. I felt the familiar sting, the automatic self-blame trying to rise, and then I felt something else push it back. Anger. Not loud, explosive anger, cold anger, clear anger. I typed a response slowly, choosing each word. I am safe. I am working. I needed to leave because I was not being treated like a person with feelings. I am not coming back to fix things. I sent it and immediately turned the phone off again, my heart pounding like I had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. That night, I sat on the back steps with my grandfather while the sun dipped below the trees. He sipped his coffee and watched the sky change colors. You know, he said after a while, sometimes people do not realize how much they rely on you until you stop carrying the weight. Not to punish them, just to wake them up. I nodded, swallowing hard. I just do not want to be cruel. He looked at me. Letting people face the consequences of their choices is not cruelty. It is honesty. The next morning brought confirmation of everything he had said. Mrs. Donnelly stopped by with a pie, claiming she had baked too much. She lingered in the doorway, her expression serious. Your dad slept in his truck last night, she said quietly. Your mom looks exhausted. Your sister had a meltdown in the driveway this morning, screaming about how everyone was against her. I closed my eyes for a second, breathing through the mix of emotions rising in me. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part felt vindicated. Both feelings existed at once, tangled and uncomfortable. I am sorry, I said automatically, the old reflex kicking in. Mrs. Donnelly shook her head. Do not apologize. This family has been leaning on you for years. Everyone knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. After she left, I went up to my room and sat on the bed, my phone heavy in my hand. I turned it back on. A new message from my father waited there. I am sorry. I did not see it. I should have. The words stopped me. They were simple, unpolished. Not a demand. Not a threat. I stared at them for a long time. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he was just scared. Either way, I was not ready to trust it yet. What I knew for sure was this: the house I had left behind was no longer holding together. The silence I had created was forcing everything to surface: the favoritism, the avoidance, the dependence. I set my phone down and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the life I was beginning to build one calm moment at a time. The first cracks had turned into fractures, and the more they struggled without me, the clearer it became that my absence was not the problem. It was the truth. I stayed there, watching the light fade, knowing the next step would not be a request, or a guilt trip, or a casual message asking about a charger. The next step would be desperation, and when that came, everything would change. Clarity arrived quietly, not as relief, but as distance, the kind that lets you see a whole shape instead of the bruise you have been staring at for years. I woke that morning in my grandparents' house with my body loose and unguarded, and it startled me how natural it felt. No scanning the air, no bracing for impact. Just the steady rhythm of a place that did not require me to perform to stay safe. I made coffee and stood at the window while it brewed, watching the street come alive. A woman jogged past with her dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Ordinary life. I realized that for the first time I was not measuring myself against anyone else's mood. The quiet was not a pause before something broke. It was the baseline. That was when the pattern rearranged itself in my mind. Not as a list of wrongs, not as a tally of pain, but as a system. From the outside, it was obvious. Inside it, I had been blind by design. I had not just helped, I had stabilized. I carried my mug to the table and set my phone beside it, screen dark. I did not dread turning it on anymore. Dread had been replaced by something colder and steadier. I turned it on and waited. Messages loaded in, one after another, like a tide pulling back. From my mother, clipped and tight, "We need to talk today." From my father, "Please call me when you can." From my aunt, "Your mom is worried. Everyone is upset." No questions, no curiosity, just the assumption that I would respond because I always had. I set the phone face down and took a sip of coffee, letting the heat ground me. The truth pressed in gently but firmly. My absence was not just emotional, it was logistical, it was structural. I had been the unseen hinge on a door everyone used without noticing. As the morning went on, pieces began to line up. Small things first. My grandmother mentioned that my mother had asked where a certain folder was, the one with insurance information and warranties and phone numbers. I had kept it updated without thinking, sliding papers into place when they came in the mail, because it bothered me when things were chaotic. She said your mom sounded frustrated, my grandmother added, not unkindly, said she could not find anything. I nodded, the picture sharpening. I had always known where everything was: bills, appointments, deadlines. I had been the quiet keeper of the calendar, the one who remembered which forms needed signatures and which notices mattered. When my father forgot, I reminded him. When my mother was overwhelmed, I stepped in. When Brooke melted down, I absorbed the spillover so it did not reach the rest of the house. I was not just support, I was infrastructure. The realization did not make me feel powerful in the way movies depict it. It made me feel sad for the girl who had done all that work without ever being acknowledged for it. It made me feel protective of the woman I was becoming. In the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. I watched it vibrate across the table, a small mechanical insistence. I did not pick it up right away. When I did, it was a message from my father. "We missed a deadline. I cannot find the paperwork. Do you know where it is?" There it was. The assumption laid bare. No greeting. No apology. Just a request that treated me like a tool left in the wrong drawer. I stared at the words until they lost their edge. Then I typed a response and deleted it. Typed another and deleted that too. Finally, I wrote, "I do not have it with me." That was all. The reply came almost immediately. "Can you check when you have a chance?" I did not answer. The quiet after that felt different. Not empty, charged. Like the pause before a realization lands. Later that day, I walked to the park a few blocks away, the one with the cracked path and the old oak trees. I sat on a bench and watched children climb and fall and get back up again. Parents hovered and laughed and scolded. No one expected a child to manage the whole playground. The thought made me smile sadly. I took out my phone and scrolled through old photos without meaning to. School events, work shifts, family gatherings where I stood slightly apart, camera in hand, capturing moments I was not fully in. I had been present without being centered, useful without being cherished. It dawned on me then that the power I had never used was not something I needed to wield. It was something I needed to stop giving away. The messages shifted tone by evening, less clipped, more scattered. From my mother this time, longer, softer, suddenly attentive. "We are just worried. Things are tense here. Brooke is having a really hard time. Can you please help us figure out next steps?" Help us? The phrase tried to slide back into my bones like it always had. I felt the reflex to respond with reassurance, with solutions, with a plan. I noticed the reflex and let it pass. I typed, "I am not available to manage this." I set the phone down and went to help my grandmother water her plants. The hose sputtered to life and then settled into a steady stream. We worked side by side without talking, and it struck me how different this help felt. Asked for, appreciated, not assumed. That night, my sister finally broke her silence. Her message came in late, sharp, and mocking. "So you think you are special now? Running away because you could not handle not being the center of attention? You are embarrassing, Mom." I read it once, and then again, the familiar twist of blame trying to hook into me. For years, that hook had always found purchase. This time, it slid off. I typed nothing. I saved the message and put my phone away. Lying in bed, I felt the fear creep in, the honest kind that does not announce itself. What if I was wrong? What if this was cruelty disguised as strength? What if I was becoming someone I did not recognize? The fear mattered. I listened to it without letting it drive. I asked myself a different question, one that cut through the fog. If I go back now, what changes? The answer came quickly and without sentiment. Nothing. I would soothe. I would organize. I would absorb. And when the next crisis came, as it always did, I would be asked to do it again. The next morning, the family tried a new approach. It was subtle, almost tender. My mother sent a message that read, "I know we have made mistakes. We can do better. Let us talk like adults." The words were carefully chosen, the promise broad and unspecific. I recognized it as damage control, not understanding. A bridge built to get me back into position. I did not cross it. Instead, I went to the library with my grandmother and sat at a long table with sunlight spilling across the wood. I worked on applications and budgets and plans that had nothing to do with keeping someone else calm. Each form I filled out felt like a small declaration. By afternoon, the pressure rose again. Calls this time, one after another. I let them ring. When I finally answered my father, his voice was tight. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "Your mom is exhausted. Brooke is out of control. We need your help." I took a breath and kept my voice steady. "I am not the solution to this." Silence stretched on the line, heavy and unfamiliar. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean you have to handle your family without me managing it." He sighed, frustration bleeding through. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." The sentence landed and slid past. Harder for whom? I said, I am stepping back. Then I ended the call. My hands shook after, the adrenaline sharp and clean. I paced the living room until it settled. This was the cost of choosing differently. The discomfort was not a sign I was wrong. It was a sign the old pattern was breaking. That evening, my grandparents and I sat on the porch with glasses of iced tea. The sky softened into pink and blue. My grandfather rocked slowly, the chair creaking in a rhythm that felt like time itself. "You are learning something important," he said, not looking at me. "Power does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint." I nodded. "It feels strange. It should. You were trained to confuse responsibility with self-erasure." The words settled deep. Responsibility. Self-erasure. I had given up one in the name of the other for years. As night fell, my phone lit up again. This time, the tone had changed entirely. The messages were no longer about feelings. They were about consequences. The bank called. "The school needs paperwork. We cannot find the contact for the counselor." Each message was a thread tugged loose. Each tug revealed how tightly the house had been bound around my quiet labor. I answered none of them. I went inside and sat at the desk in the spare room, a lamp casting a small pool of light. I wrote down what I knew and what I did not, what I would offer and what I would not. The list surprised me with its simplicity. I would not rescue. I would not manage. I would not absorb blame. What I would do instead was wait. Waiting was not passive. It was deliberate. It allowed the truth to surface without my interference. Close to midnight, a message came in that crossed a line. From my aunt, forwarded from my mother. "We are telling people you left over nothing and that you are being dramatic. We need you to come home and clear this up." There it was. The story being written without me. The first attempt to turn my absence into a flaw. I felt anger rise, hot and focused. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that clarifies. I did not respond. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to my own breathing. The fear was still there, but it no longer ran the room. I could feel the shape of what was coming next. The family would not stop at frustration. They would push. They would accuse. They would escalate. And when they did, I would not rush to explain. I lay down and closed my eyes, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a promise. The power I had never used was no longer hidden from me. It was in my hands every time I chose not to step back into the role they needed me to play. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering against the road. Somewhere else, a door slammed. Somewhere else, voices rose. Here, I rested. I knew the next messages would not ask for help. They would demand accountability, and that would change everything. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in through side doors and polite words, through voices that had never spoken to me directly before. I woke that morning with the sense that something had shifted again, not inside me this time, but around the story my family was telling about me. I knew it before I checked my phone. There were messages waiting, not just from my parents now, but from people who had never intervened before. An aunt I saw twice a year. A cousin I barely knew. Even an old family friend who used to pat my head at holidays and tell me how lucky my parents were to have such a good girl. "Your mom is heartbroken. This is tearing the family apart. You only get one family. Be the bigger person." Each message carried the same weight wrapped in different words. Come back. Fix it. Make us comfortable again. I sat at the edge of the bed and let the phone rest in my hands, feeling the familiar tug at my chest. For years, that tug had always meant one thing: obligation. If people were upset, it was my job to smooth things out. If the family was tense, I was supposed to absorb it. but something in me had changed. The tug was still there, but it no longer pulled me forward. It just existed, like an echo. I went downstairs and poured myself coffee, the sound of it filling the kitchen steady and grounding. My grandmother was at the table with her crossword, my grandfather reading the paper. They looked up and smiled. No questions, no expectations. "You look serious," my grandfather said lightly. I shrugged. "The family is mobilizing." My grandmother snorted softly. "That sounds about right." I smiled despite myself. They knew. Of course they did. They had lived long enough to recognize patterns without needing them explained. As the day went on, the messages escalated. The tone shifted from concern to accusation, from worry to moral pressure. "Your sister is falling apart because of you. Your parents are embarrassed. People are talking. Do you really want to be known as the daughter who abandoned her family?" That one hit harder than the rest. Abandoned. It was a word that carried judgment and finality, a word that made me sound reckless and cruel instead of tired and done. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I reminded myself of something important. People who benefit from your silence will always call you loud when you finally speak. In the afternoon, my father called again. I watched the phone ring until it stopped, then called him back when I felt steady enough. His voice sounded strained, older somehow. "This has gone too far," he said. "Everyone is upset. Your mom cannot stop crying. Brooke is acting out even more. People are starting to ask questions." I leaned against the counter, my free hand resting on the cool surface. "What questions? Why you left? What happened? What kind of family lets this happen?" The words were careful, but the meaning underneath them was sharp. Reputation, appearances, control of the narrative. I asked quietly, "Have you told them why my birthday was canceled?" Silence. "Have you told them that I asked for one thing and was told it did not matter?" More silence. "I did not think so," I said. "You are making this about the wrong thing," he replied, frustration bleeding through. "This is bigger than a birthday." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "You are right. It is bigger. That is why I left." He sighed. "You are hurting your mother." I closed my eyes. "She hurt me first." The line went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "We were just trying to keep the peace." That sentence used to dismantle me. It had been the justification for everything. This time, I heard it clearly for what it was. "You were keeping a system," I said. "One that worked for you." I ended the call before he could respond. Not long after, my sister tried a different tactic. Her message was not angry. It was sweet, almost childish. "I miss you. The house feels weird without you. Can you just come back for a little while? Mom says we can talk." I stared at the words, remembering every time she had lashed out and then expected comfort. Every tantrum followed by forgiveness she never had to earn. I typed, "I am not coming back to be the solution to problems I did not create." Her reply came fast and venomous. "So now you think you are better than us. Enjoy playing the victim." I put the phone down and walked outside, the air crisp against my skin. I paced the length of the yard, letting the anger move through me instead of settling inside. I realized then that this was the part most people never talk about. The backlash. The moment when refusing your old role makes you the enemy. I sat on the porch steps and watched the clouds drift slowly overhead. I thought about all the times I had been called mature, responsible, understanding. How those words had always meant the same thing. Convenient. By evening, the pressure turned into something else. My aunt showed up at my grandparents' door, unannounced, her smile tight and polite. She hugged me like nothing was wrong, then sat down at the table with my grandmother, her hands folded carefully. "We are worried about you," she began. "This situation is making the family look bad." I almost laughed. "There it was," said out loud. I did not respond, so she continued. "Your mother is devastated. Your sister is struggling. People are starting to judge." "Judge whom?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. "Well, everyone." I leaned back in my chair. "Then maybe they should know the truth." Her eyes widened slightly. "There is no need to air private matters." I met her gaze. "The matter was private when it was only hurting me." My grandmother cleared her throat. "We are not forcing Claire to do anything," she said firmly. "She is safe, and she is thinking." My aunt looked between us, clearly not expecting resistance. "I just think she should consider forgiveness." I nodded slowly. Forgiveness comes after accountability. The room went quiet. My aunt gathered her purse a few minutes later and left, her concern never quite reaching her eyes. That night, I lay awake thinking about something my grandfather had said days earlier. Power does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint. I was beginning to understand the cost of restraint. It was loneliness, misunderstanding, being talked about instead of talked to. The next morning brought the first real crack in the story they were telling. My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor I barely knew. "I hope you are okay. Your mom was yelling in the driveway this morning. Your sister was screaming at her. It sounded awful." Another message followed from a former coworker of my mother. "She came in late today and looked wrecked. She kept saying she did not know what went wrong with you." I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. The narrative was spreading, but so was the chaos they could no longer hide. I realized then that the family could control what they said, but not what people saw. And without me there to cushion the blows, the truth was louder than any explanation. By afternoon, my mother sent a message that felt different from the others. "We need to talk in person. No guilt, no accusation, no demand to come home. Just that." I felt my pulse quicken. This was it. The moment everyone had been circling around. The confrontation they could not avoid now that silence had failed. I did not answer right away. I went for a walk instead, letting my thoughts stretch out. If I met them now, it would not be to apologize or explain myself. It would be to be heard. When I got back, my grandparents were waiting for me in the living room, the air heavier than usual. "Your mother called us," my grandfather said. "She wants to meet." I nodded. "I know." My grandmother reached for my hand. "It will not be easy." I squeezed her fingers. "I am not doing it to make it easy." That evening, my father sent another message, shorter this time. "We will come by tomorrow. We need to clear the air." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar mix of dread and resolve settle into place. This was the moment when everything could slide back into old patterns if I let it. Tears, apologies, promises, pressure to move on without change. I would not let that happen. I typed back, "We can meet. Not at the house. And I am not coming alone." The reply came slower this time. "Okay." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My heart was pounding, but beneath it was something steady and unmovable. They were coming not because they wanted reconciliation, but because they were losing control of the story. The family alliances had fractured. The pressure had backfired. The role I had played so quietly for years could not be filled by guilt or force. Tomorrow, they would sit across from me without the protection of routine or authority. Tomorrow, I would say things that could not be unsaid. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the last light of day fade into night. Somewhere across town, my family was bracing for a conversation they had avoided for years, and for the first time, I was not afraid of it. I was ready. Morning arrived heavier than the night before, like the air itself knew what was coming. I woke before my alarm, my mind already running through possibilities I did not want to entertain. Not outcomes, but tactics. Tears, anger, guilt dressed up as concern. Promises made too quickly. I lay still for a while, listening to the house wake up, my grandparents moving softly downstairs, the smell of coffee drifting up the hall. This was the day. I got dressed slowly, choosing clothes that felt like armor without looking like it. Simple, clean, nothing that could be commented on. I tied my hair back and looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. The girl looking back did not look scared. She looked alert, awake. At breakfast, my grandmother poured me coffee and sat across from me, her hands folded around her mug. My grandfather watched me over the rim of his glasses. "You do not owe anyone comfort today," my grandmother said quietly. I nodded. "I know." My grandfather added, "Say what you need to say. Do not rush to fill silence. Let it do its job." Their calm steadied me more than any speech could have. They were not asking me to be gentle. They were asking me to be honest. The drive to their house felt shorter than usual, as if time had decided not to stretch itself today. I kept my phone face down in my bag, not wanting to see if there were last-minute messages. If there were, they could wait. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach tightened. My parents' car was already there. So was Brooke's. The sight of it sparked something sharp in my chest, a reminder of how many confrontations in my life had begun and ended with her emotions dominating the room. I took a breath and got out of the car. Inside, the house felt different with everyone there. Too quiet, too staged. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, her posture rigid, her hands twisting together. My father stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out like he wanted to be anywhere else. Brooke leaned back in a chair, scrolling on her phone, one leg bouncing impatiently. No one spoke at first. My grandparents sat down on either side of me without a word, a quiet show of solidarity that did not go unnoticed. I could feel my mother's eyes flick toward them, then back to me. My mom broke the silence first. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her voice already trembling. "We just want to understand what is going on." I nodded slowly. "You wanted to talk?" She winced slightly, like my tone had caught her off guard. "Your father and I have been so worried," she continued. "You left without telling us. Your sister has been devastated. This is not like you." There it was, the familiar framing. I was the one who had changed. I was the disruption. I took a breath. "You are right. It is not like the version of me you are used to, the version who absorbs everything so no one else has to feel uncomfortable." Brooke scoffed without looking up from her phone. "Oh my God. You left because of a party. You are blowing this way out of proportion." I turned toward her, my voice calm. "Do you really think this is about a party?" She rolled her eyes. "It sure looks like it." Before I could respond, my grandfather cleared his throat. "We are here to listen today," he said firmly. "Not to interrupt. Not to dismiss. Claire will speak." Brooke looked up then, irritation flashing across her face. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small stack of papers, setting them on the coffee table between us. They made a soft sound as they landed, louder in the silence than they should have been. "This is not about one day," I said. "It is about a pattern." Every time something was meant to be about me, it became about keeping Brooke calm. Every time I needed support, I was told to be understanding. And every time she wanted something, the entire house rearranged itself to give it to her. My mother shook her head. "We were trying to keep the peace." "You were keeping a system," I said. "One where her comfort mattered more than my existence." My father finally spoke, his voice low. "We thought you were strong, independent. You never complained." I let out a short breath. You confused silence with strength. You assumed that because I did not explode, I was not breaking. I slid one of the papers toward my mother. It was a printed screenshot of a message she had sent in our family chat the week before my birthday. We are canceling Claire's party. Brooke is too upset. We will do something later. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just logistics centered around Brooke's feelings. My mother stared at it, her face draining of color. I did not mean it like that, she whispered. But you did, I replied. Not cruelly, just firmly. You have meant it like that for years. Brooke shifted in her chair, folding her arms. This is ridiculous. You are acting like we abused you or something. I looked at her. Really looked. You learned that if you cried long enough, everything stopped for you. And you used it. You knew exactly what you were doing. Her eyes flashed. That is not fair. I reached into my bag again and took out my phone. My hands were steady as I pressed play. Her voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. If I cry long enough, Mom cancels anything. She does not care who she hurts as long as I calm down. The room went very still. Brooke's face went white. You recorded me, she shrieked. That is so messed up. What is messed up, I said, is that you bragged about hurting me and no one stopped you. My mother looked between us, horror dawning. Is that true? She whispered to Brooke. Did you manipulate us like that? Brooke opened her mouth, then closed it. Everyone does it, she said weakly. I just needed things to stop. My father sank into the chair behind him, rubbing his face. My grandparents stared at Brooke like they were seeing her for the first time. For once, her tears did not fix everything. I leaned forward, my voice steady but heavy. I did not leave to punish you. I left because staying was destroying me. Because every time I tried to speak up, I was told to be patient. Because when my 18th birthday, the one milestone that was supposed to be mine, was canceled to keep her calm, something finally clicked. I would never matter as long as I stayed silent. My mother started crying in earnest then, her shoulders shaking. We were trying to keep the family together, she said. You were holding it together by letting it break me, I replied. Peace is when everyone's needs matter. What you built was a system where one person's comfort cost another person's voice. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father looked up at me, his eyes red. So what do you want us to do? I took a breath. First, stop asking me to come back and fix things. I am not your emotional safety net anymore. Second, get her real help instead of letting her tantrums run the house. And third, stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. It was a choice. Repeatedly. My mother wiped her face. Do you ever plan to come home? I shook my head slowly. I do not know. Right now, I am building a life where I am not invisible. I am not giving that up to return to the same role. My grandparents nodded in quiet approval. Brooke stared at the floor, her usual fire gone, replaced by something smaller and uglier. My father looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. We failed you, he said quietly, and if you never forgive us, I understand. The weight shifted then. Not lifted. Shifted. For the first time, the guilt was not sitting on my chest. It belonged where it should have always belonged. I stood up, my legs steady. I do not know what our relationship will look like going forward, I said. Maybe we rebuild something new. Maybe we do not. But the version of me that disappears so everyone else can stay comfortable is gone. No one stopped me as I walked toward the door. No one asked me to stay and soothe the room. Outside, the air felt cleaner, like I could finally take a full breath. I stepped down onto the porch, my grandparents close behind me, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was running away. I felt like I had finally arrived somewhere honest. Behind us, the house was quiet. Not peaceful, not healed. Just quiet in the way things get right before consequences settle in. And I knew, without doubt, that what had been said inside those walls would not stay there. The next phase would not be about confrontation, it would be about fallout. The fallout moved faster than I expected, like a door that had been held shut for years finally swinging open on its own. By the time we got back to my grandparents' house, my phone was already buzzing in my bag, vibrating against the folder of papers like it was trying to crawl out and demand my attention. I did not check it right away. I helped my grandmother put away groceries she had picked up earlier. I rinsed a few dishes that did not need. Rinsing, I stood at the sink and let the water run over my hands until my breathing slowed down. The meeting had taken something out of me, not because I had yelled or broken down, but because I had held steady and told the truth without cushioning it. That kind of honesty leaves a mark. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table and pulled my phone out, the screen lit up with a cluster of missed calls and messages. My mother, my father, Brooke, my aunt again, 2 cousins, a number I did not recognize. There were also 3 messages from people I never expected to hear from, neighbors, a teacher from my old middle school, even Mrs. Donnelly, who apparently had become the unofficial news station for our street. The first message I opened was from my mother. "Please do not share that recording with anyone. We will handle this privately. You have made your point. Now stop." I read it twice, feeling the shift in her words. Not "I am sorry," not "I understand." Handle it privately. Made your point. Stop. Even now, she wanted to control the damage more than she wanted to sit with the cause. My father's message came next. "Can you talk? Not about feelings. About what is happening now. This is serious." That made my stomach tighten. Not because I was afraid, but because I recognized that tone. My father rarely used the word serious unless something practical was on the line. Money, work, reputation, something he could measure. He could ignore tears. He could not ignore consequences. Brooke's message was shorter and sharper. "You humiliated me. Everyone knows now. You are dead to me." I let out a slow breath and set the phone down. I did not feel the sting I expected. The threat of being dead to her had no weight when I realized how little space she had ever made for me to be alive in the first place. My grandmother watched me from across the table, her expression calm but alert. "You do not have to respond right now," she said. I nodded. "I know, but something is different." My grandfather came in from the yard, wiping his hands on a towel. He took one look at my face and said, "Your father is not the dramatic type. If he says serious, something is burning." That line made me laugh softly, but the laughter did not last. I stared at my father's message again, then at my mother's, then back at my father's. There was a split happening, and I could feel it. My mother was focused on the recording, the embarrassment, the story. My father was focused on what was happening behind the curtain. I called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and tight. "Thank you." I did not respond to that. I just waited. He exhaled hard, like he had been holding his breath all day. "Your mom is losing it. Brooke is. I do not even know what to call it. She has been screaming about you, about us, about everyone. She threatened to post things online. She called her friends and told them you are a liar. Then she told them you are mentally unstable. She is trying to rewrite everything." I closed my eyes. Of course she was. Then he said, "The school called." I opened my eyes again. "What?" "They want to meet." Brooke missed multiple days. She has been disruptive. And now there is talk about an evaluation, and your mom is panicking because she cannot find half the paperwork, and she cannot handle another meeting where she cries and looks like she has no control. She told them you handled that stuff. She actually said your name." My jaw tightened. "She told them I handled it." "Yes. And they asked why you are not home. And your mother said you are going through a phase." A phase. I felt a slow heat rise under my skin, not explosive, just steady. "So she is still making me the problem." Your dad's voice got rougher. "That is why I am calling. Not to drag you back. I cannot do that. After today, I cannot. But I need you to know something else is going on." I sat up straighter. "What?" There was a pause. Then he spoke carefully, like he was choosing each word. "Your mom has been hiding some things from me. Not the favoritism, I knew that. I mean practical things. Financial things. I found a letter in the kitchen drawer that was not supposed to be there. It was from a law office." My stomach dropped. "A law office." He continued quickly, like he was afraid he would lose nerve. "It was about your grandmother, your other grandmother, my mom. She left something in her will, and it is tied up in the family business, and your mom signed something she should not have signed. I do not fully understand it yet, but I know one thing. Your name was on the paperwork as a witness, and I do not remember you ever seeing it." My throat went dry. I felt the room tilt slightly, like the story had just shifted onto a different track. "I did not sign anything," I said slowly. "That is what I thought." His voice cracked, anger pushing through. "I think your mom used you. I think she put your name down because you were always around, always helping, always the reliable one. She assumed you would never question it." I stared at the wall, my mind racing through every time my mother had asked me to sign permission slips, to fill out forms, to drop papers at the post office. I had trusted her. I had trusted the idea of family so deeply that I never imagined she would use my name as a tool. My grandfather sat down across from me, his face hardening as he listened to my half of the conversation. My grandmother's hand found my shoulder, steady and warm. I swallowed. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because it is unraveling. Your mom is panicking about the school meeting, and now she is panicking about this letter, and she is blaming you for leaving because she cannot keep up. She said you were supposed to be here to help. That was her exact phrasing." My stomach turned. Supposed to be here to help. My father's voice softened slightly. "Claire, I am not asking you to fix it. I am telling you because if your name is on something you did not actually sign or witness, that can come back on you. And your mother is not thinking clearly. She is thinking about saving herself." The words landed like ice water. It was the first time my father had ever said anything that directly challenged my mother's image as the stressed but well-meaning parent. Hearing him speak that way felt like watching a wall crack. I asked, "Where is the letter now?" "I put it in my glove compartment." He sounded ashamed, like I was hiding it, but I did not want Brooke to see it and blow it up. "Your mom is acting like this is your fault too. She said if you had not caused chaos, she would have had time to deal with it." I let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. I did not cause chaos. I stopped absorbing it. Silence. Then he said, "Your mom wants another meeting. With you. She said it has to be soon, before the school meeting, before anyone else finds out about the letter. She is scared." My grandmother's hand tightened on my shoulder. My grandfather leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "Tell him you will not meet them alone." I nodded, even though my father could not see it. "If there is another meeting, it will be here," I said, "with Grandma and Grandpa present. And I am not discussing anything without understanding exactly what my name is attached to." My father exhaled, relief and dread mixing. "Okay." Then he added, "Brooke is telling people you are trying to destroy the family because you were jealous. She told our neighbor you stole money. She is making up things. Your mom did not correct her. She just kept saying you were emotional. My pulse stayed steady, but something in me sharpened. The story had gone from unfair to dangerous. Accusations like that could follow me, could affect my job, my future, the life I was trying to build. I said quietly, "I want copies of anything with my name on it." "I will get them," he replied. When I ended the call, I sat very still. My grandparents watched me, waiting. My voice came out steady, but my hands were cold. They are not just panicking because the house is loud. They are panicking because something bigger is exposed. My grandfather's eyes narrowed. "Something legal." I nodded. My grandmother sat down beside me. "Honey, you cannot let them drag you into paperwork without protection." I swallowed hard. That is what scares me. Not that they miss me, not that they are upset, that they used me without even seeing me. The room felt quiet in a different way after that, like the air itself had thickened. I looked at my phone again. My mother had sent more messages while I was on the call. "We have to handle this like a family. Do not bring your grandparents into it. You are making everything worse. You owe us a conversation without an audience." I stared at the phrase "without an audience." That was the whole point. My mother wanted the old stage back, the one where she controlled the lighting and the script, where my silence filled in the gaps. I typed a reply, slowly, carefully. "If there is going to be another conversation, it will be on my terms. I will not meet alone. I will not be blamed for problems I did not create. And I will not discuss any paperwork with my name on it until I see it." I sent it, then put the phone down. For a while, nothing happened. Then my phone buzzed again. A message from my father, short, "Tomorrow afternoon. They will come. I will bring copies." My stomach tightened, but my mind stayed clear. This was not going to be a tearful family meeting anymore. This was going to be a reckoning with consequences, not just emotions. I stood up and walked to the spare room, closing the door behind me. I sat at the desk and took out a notebook. I started writing down everything I remembered. Dates, moments, errands, papers my mother had asked me to deliver, things she had told me to sign, not because I wanted revenge in the messy, dramatic sense, because I wanted truth, because I wanted protection. The girl I used to be would have gone into that meeting hoping to be understood. The woman I was becoming was going into it prepared. I heard my grandparents' voices downstairs, low and steady, making plans without making me feel like a burden. My grandmother said something about calling a lawyer she trusted. My grandfather said something about boundaries, about not letting anyone raise their voice in this house. I closed my eyes for a moment and let myself feel the fear, the real one, the one that comes when you realize your family's dysfunction is not just emotional, it can leave fingerprints on your future. Then I opened my eyes and kept writing. By the time the sun started to set, my notebook had pages filled with facts, not feelings. My chest felt tight, but my spine felt straighter. I was not walking into tomorrow as the family fixer. I was walking into tomorrow as someone who finally understood what was at stake. And if my mother thought she could still control the story, still control me, she was about to learn what happens when the invisible pillar stops holding up the roof and starts asking who built it wrong in the first place. They arrived just after 3, earlier than planned, like they were afraid momentum would slip away if they waited. I saw my parents' car pull into the driveway through the living room window, my stomach tightening not with fear, but with focus. This was the moment everything narrowed down to truth or denial, and there would be no room left for performance. My grandparents were already seated when the doorbell rang, my grandfather straight-backed in his chair, my grandmother calm in that way that came from having seen too many storms to be impressed by thunder. I stood between them for a second, feeling the solid presence at my sides, then walked to the door and opened it. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. her eyes red, her mouth already set in that familiar line that meant she was preparing to defend herself. My father stood a step behind her, jaw tight, a folder tucked under his arm. Brooke was there too, arms crossed, face closed off, daring the room to challenge her. No one hugged me. No one asked how I was. That alone told me everything. We moved into the living room and sat down, the air heavy with things unsaid. My mother spoke first because she always did. "We need to talk calmly," she said. "This has gotten out of hand." I nodded. "Then let us talk honestly." She flinched slightly at the word. My father cleared his throat and placed the folder on the coffee table, sliding it toward me. "Here, copies of everything I could find." I picked it up and did not open it yet. I wanted to hear them before I looked at paper. My mother leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Before you start accusing people, you need to understand how much stress we are under. Brooke has been spiraling. The school is on our backs. The neighbors are watching. This is not the time to tear the family apart." I met her gaze steadily. I did not tear anything apart. I stopped holding it together. Brooke snorted. "You really think you are some kind of hero now?" I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on my mother. "Something slipped earlier," I said, "when Dad called me. Something that matters more than your embarrassment." My mother stiffened. "What are you talking about?" I tapped the folder lightly. "My name." Silence fell, thick and sudden. My father shifted in his seat. "The letter was from a law office," he said quietly. "About my mother's estate. There were signatures on documents that did not make sense. Claire's name was listed as a witness." My mother turned on him sharply. "I told you that was nothing." "You told me not to worry about it," he replied. "That is not the same thing." I opened the folder then, my hand steady as I flipped through the pages. Dates. Legal language. My name typed neatly where it should not have been. I felt something cold and clean settle in my chest. "I did not sign this," I said calmly. "I was not present for this." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes flicked to my grandparents, then back to me. "We were just trying to move things along," she said. "You were always helping, always available." I did not think it would matter. The words landed like stones. "You did not think it would matter to use my name without my consent," I said. "You did not think it would matter because you did not think of me as someone who would question you." Brooke scoffed. "Oh, please. You would have signed if she asked." I turned to her then, my voice still level. "That is exactly the problem. You all assumed I would do whatever was needed to keep things running." My father looked at my mother, his expression darkening. "Did you forge her signature?" She recoiled. "I did not forge anything. I just wrote her name." She was always around. She never objected to helping. "Helping is not the same as consent," my grandmother said firmly. My mother's voice rose. "I was under pressure. Your sister needed stability. Your father was busy. Things had to be handled." "Handled by me," I said quietly, "without my knowledge." The room seemed to shrink around us. My father rubbed his face with both hands, a sound escaping him that was half breath, half regret. "This is serious," he said. "This is not just family stuff. This can affect her future." I nodded. "That is why I left." My mother stared at me like I had struck her. "You left because of this." I shook my head. "I left because I was invisible. This just proves how deep that invisibility went." Brooke jumped to her feet. "You are blowing this up on purpose. You want to ruin us." I looked at her, really looked, and saw something I had never let myself see before. Fear. Not the fragile kind she used to control the room, but the sharp kind that came when power slipped away. "I am not ruining anything," I said. "I am refusing to cover it up." My mother started crying then, loud and desperate. We were trying to protect everyone. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted things to get this bad? I did not soften. Wanting something and doing it anyway are not opposites. My father straightened. We are not putting this on her. He gestured to me. We are not asking her to fix it. We are going to get a lawyer and straighten it out properly. My mother turned to him in disbelief. You are taking her side. I am taking the side of reality, he said. For the first time in my life, someone else said it out loud. I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. I am not here to threaten you, I said. I am here to make something clear. I am not participating in anything that uses my name, my labor, or my silence without my consent. Not now. Not ever. My mother sobbed harder. We are losing everything. No, I said. You are losing control. That stopped her. Brooke folded her arms again, her voice bitter. So what now? You cut us off. You make us beg. I shook my head. I am not asking for apologies. I am not asking for promises. I am setting boundaries. My grandfather leaned forward slightly. This conversation is over for today. Emotions are too high. The next steps will involve professionals, not pressure. My mother looked at me through tears. Do you even care what happens to us? I held her gaze. I care enough not to lie for you anymore. Silence followed, heavy but clean. My father gathered the folder and stood. We will handle this the right way. He looked at me then. Really looked. I am sorry, not just for this, for everything I did not see. I nodded once. That was enough for now. They left shortly after, Brooke storming out ahead of them, my mother trailing behind, her sobs echoing down the walkway. When the door closed, the house felt larger, lighter, like a pressure valve had finally released. I sat back down, my legs trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. My grandmother placed a hand on my arm. You did well, she said. I exhaled. It does not feel like winning. My grandfather shook his head. Justice rarely does. It just feels honest. That night, my phone stayed quiet for a long time. When it finally buzzed, it was a single message from my father. The lawyer appointment is scheduled. Your name will be cleared. I promise. I stared at the words, then set the phone down. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft colors that had nothing to do with my family or their chaos. I stood at the window and watched it, feeling the strange mix of grief and relief settle into something stable. The truth had been spoken. The system had been exposed. What happened next was no longer mine to manage. For the first time, the weight was not on my shoulders. It was on theirs. And they would have to carry it without me. The house did not feel victorious after they left. It felt emptied out, like something heavy had been carried through it and set down somewhere else. I sat at the dining table long after the car disappeared down the street. My hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, listening to the quiet settle into the walls. It was a different quiet than before. Not the tense kind that waited for the next explosion. This one felt like aftermath. My grandparents moved around me gently, giving me space without making it feel like distance. My grandmother put a blanket over my shoulders when she thought I was not looking. My grandfather turned the radio on low in the other room, an old jazz station that hummed softly like a heartbeat. I did not cry. That surprised me. I had imagined that moment for years, imagined the confrontation ending in tears that would finally release everything I had held inside. Instead, I felt drained and steady at the same time, like I had run a long race and crossed the finish line without collapsing. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no jolting awake, just darkness and rest. The morning after was when the reality of consequences began to show itself, not dramatically, but in small, unmistakable ways. My phone buzzed while I was helping my grandmother with the dishes. I dried my hands slowly before checking it, already knowing it would not be a simple message. It was from my mother. "We need to talk again. This cannot end like this." I stared at the words for a moment, then set the phone down without replying. A few minutes later, another message came in, this time from my father. The lawyer confirmed it. "Your name will be removed from everything. I am sorry it ever came to this." I replied to him with a single sentence. "Thank you for telling me." Nothing more. The rest of the day unfolded quietly, but the tension hummed beneath everything. News travels fast in a family, especially one that had relied so heavily on pretending. By afternoon, the messages began arriving from extended relatives, toned differently now. "I heard things are complicated. I hope everyone can heal. Families make mistakes. No accusations this time, no demands. Just the awkward language people use when they realize the story they were fed was incomplete." I let those messages sit unanswered too. That evening, my sister tried again. Her text was longer than usual, her tone less sharp, though the edge was still there. "You really embarrassed me. People at school are asking questions. Mom is a wreck. I do not know what you wanted to prove, but this is not fair." I read it twice, then placed the phone face down on the table. My first instinct was to explain, to clarify, to soften. The second instinct was to defend myself. I ignored both. I went outside instead and sat on the porch steps, the wood warm beneath me from the day's sun. I watched the sky change colors slowly, the way it always did, indifferent to family drama and moral reckonings. What I wanted to prove. That phrase echoed in my mind. I had not wanted to prove anything. I had wanted to survive. The next few days revealed the true shape of the damage. My parents did not present a united front anymore. That much was clear from the messages that came in separately, often contradicting each other. My mother sent updates filled with emotional language, exhausted, heartbroken, overwhelmed. She spoke about how hard things were now that everyone was upset, how she felt judged by neighbors, how she could not sleep. My father sent short, factual messages. Lawyer appointment completed. School meeting scheduled. Brooke referred for evaluation. He did not ask me to intervene. He did not ask me to explain anything. He simply informed me. That difference mattered. One afternoon, my grandmother came into the room where I was reading and sat beside me. "Your mother called again," she said gently. "She asked if I could talk you into coming home, at least temporarily. She said the house feels wrong without you." I closed my book. "What did you say?" "I said you are not an appliance she can unplug and plug back in," my grandmother replied calmly, "and that if the house feels wrong, perhaps it always has." I smiled faintly. "Thank you." She squeezed my hand. "You are doing the hardest thing. You are letting people feel what they avoided by leaning on you." The phrase stayed with me. Letting people feel. I had spent my whole life cushioning everyone else from discomfort. Now, by doing nothing at all, I was forcing the truth to land where it belonged. That did not mean it was easy. Some nights, guilt crept in quietly, sitting beside me like an unwanted guest. I would picture my mother alone in the kitchen, my father staring at paperwork he did not fully understand, my sister pacing her room, furious and exposed. I reminded myself of something important. Feeling guilt did not mean I was wrong. It meant I was human. One evening, my father called unexpectedly. His voice sounded tired, stripped of pretense. "I just wanted to tell you," he said, "that I see it now. Not just the paperwork, the pattern. You were holding everything together so the rest of us did not have to change." I swallowed. "That matters." He hesitated. "I am not asking you to forgive us. I do not think forgiveness can be rushed. I just wanted you to know I am trying to do this differently now." I nodded, even though he could not see me. That is all I need to hear right now. After we hung up, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief. Recognition. Meanwhile, my sister spiraled in ways I could no longer ignore, even from a distance. She posted vague messages online about betrayal and fake people. She told relatives conflicting stories. One minute she claimed I had abandoned the family, the next she claimed I had been manipulating everyone for years. The contradiction spoke louder than any defense I could have offered. I did not engage. The family tried once more to test my boundaries a week later. My mother sent a message framed as an invitation. "We are having dinner on Sunday. It would mean a lot if you came. We can pretend things are normal for one night." I stared at the word pretend. I typed back carefully. "I am not ready to pretend. I hope dinner goes well." The reply came quickly and sharply. "So you are really doing this? You are choosing yourself over your family?" I read it slowly, then replied, "I am choosing honesty over erasure." I turned my phone off after that and went for a long walk, letting the air clear my head. When I came back, my grandparents were in the living room, talking quietly. They looked up when I entered. "You holding up?" my grandfather asked. I nodded. Better than I expected. That was the truth. The more I refused to step back into my old role, the lighter I felt. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer mine to manage. The family began to adjust, awkwardly and imperfectly. My mother leaned harder on friends, some of whom began to ask questions she could not easily deflect. My father took on responsibilities he had always assumed I would handle. My sister faced consequences she had never experienced before, boundaries enforced by people who were no longer buffered by my silence. And me. I started building something new. I picked up extra shifts at work and saved aggressively. I researched housing options. I made plans that did not involve checking anyone else's mood first. I spent evenings with my grandparents talking about things that mattered and things that did not, learning the difference between support and dependency. One afternoon, while sorting through paperwork at the kitchen table, I found the notebook I had filled the night before the second meeting. Pages of facts, dates, memories, proof. I closed it and set it aside. I did not need it anymore. The truth had already done its work. That night, my phone buzzed one last time before bed. It was a message from my mother, shorter than the others, stripped of drama. "I do not understand everything yet, but I am starting to see how much you did for us. I wish I had seen it sooner." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar pull to respond with reassurance, with comfort. I did not. Instead, I set the phone down and turned off the light, letting the room fall into darkness. Understanding, if it came, would have to grow without my guidance. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought settled into place with quiet certainty. The old version of my family could not exist without my silence, and the old version of me was never coming back. Whatever came next would be built on different ground, with different rules, and I was finally okay with that. I noticed it when I reached for my phone and didn't feel that familiar spike of dread. It was late afternoon, sunlight spilling across the small living room of my apartment, dust floating lazily in the air. The phone was face down on the coffee table, silent. No missed calls, no urgent messages, no crisis waiting for me to solve. For the first time, the absence of noise did not feel temporary. It felt earned. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes, letting myself sit with that realization. The chaos I had grown up inside had finally lost its grip on me, not because it disappeared, but because I stepped outside of it. That difference mattered. Life, after leaving, did not unfold in dramatic scenes. There were no movie moments where everyone suddenly understood. Instead, there were quiet shifts, subtle but unmistakable. I woke up at the same time every morning now, not because anxiety dragged me out of sleep, but because my body had found its rhythm again. I made breakfast without rushing, washed dishes without bracing for raised voices, left the apartment knowing I would return to the same calm I left behind. Work became something I did, not something I escaped into. I laughed more easily. I spoke without rehearsing my words first. People noticed, not in a dramatic way, but in the way they lingered a little longer in conversation, like they sensed something had settled into place. One evening, after a long shift, I walked home as the sky darkened, the city lights blinking on one by one. I passed families sitting down to dinner, couples arguing softly through open windows, laughter drifting out of restaurants. All of it felt distant and close at the same time. I loved my family. That truth had not changed. But love no longer meant sacrificing myself to keep the peace. When I got home, my phone buzzed. I picked it up slowly. It was my mother. I almost didn't open the message, not out of fear, but out of choice. I wanted to be sure I was reading it because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. I opened it. "I went back to the house today," she wrote. "I walked past your room and realized how empty it felt. Not because you're gone, but because I finally noticed how much of yourself you left behind there. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. I just needed you to know I see it now." I sat down at the kitchen table, the chair scraping softly against the floor. My chest tightened, not painfully, but with the weight of something long delayed. Seeing was not the same as fixing, but it was not nothing either. I typed slowly. "I'm glad you're seeing it. I'm still figuring out what our relationship looks like now." She replied a few minutes later. "I understand. I'll wait." That word again. Wait. It did not come with guilt this time. It did not come with pressure. It stood alone. I set the phone down and stared out the window, the city humming below. The boundary had held again. Each time it did, it felt a little more solid, like a wall built brick by brick instead of an emergency barricade thrown together in a panic. My father reached out less often, but when he did, his messages were grounded, practical. Updates about therapy appointments, about setting rules that were actually enforced, about learning how to stay present instead of retreating into silence. One night, he called. I answered, already prepared to end the conversation if it drifted into old territory. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "We had dinner tonight. It was tense." Brooke tried to push. "Your mother didn't give in." I didn't step back. I closed my eyes, absorbing the image. "That sounds hard," I said. "It is," he admitted. "But it's necessary. And I know now that asking you to come back would only undo it." I felt a quiet wave of relief. "Thank you for understanding that." We talked a little longer, about ordinary things, work, the weather, nothing heavy. When we hung up, I noticed something important. I wasn't exhausted. Conversations with my family no longer drained me because I was no longer performing. I wasn't managing their emotions. I wasn't anticipating their reactions. I was just present. That was new. My sister was the last to shift, and even then it was uneven. Some weeks, she went silent. Other weeks, she sent sharp messages, still angry, still convinced I had ruined her life by refusing to absorb it for her. One message arrived late one night. "Everyone is acting like I'm the problem now. They never did that before." I stared at it, feeling a flicker of sadness for the version of her that had never been told no. But sadness did not mean responsibility. I typed back. "Being held accountable feels different when you're not used to it." She didn't reply, and I didn't chase her silence. As months passed, my apartment began to feel fully mine. I hung photos on the walls. I bought a secondhand bookshelf and filled it with things I loved. I invited friends over without worrying about who might explode over the noise. Sometimes I would sit on the floor with my back against the couch, tea in my hands, and think about how much energy I had spent trying to keep everyone else comfortable. I wondered what my life might have looked like if I had stepped away sooner. Then I reminded myself that timing matters. I left when I was ready to leave, when staying would have cost me something I couldn't afford to lose: my sense of self. One afternoon, my grandmother came to visit. She stood in the middle of my living room, looking around slowly, taking everything in. "You did good," she said quietly. I smiled. "I learned from the best." She sat beside me on the couch, her hand warm on mine. "You know," she said, "people often confuse loyalty with endurance. They think if you can survive something, you should. But survival is not the same as living." Her words settled into me, fitting perfectly with everything I had learned the hard way. The last message from my mother came weeks later. It was brief. "Therapy is helping. I'm learning to sit with discomfort instead of fixing it. I don't know where this leads, but I wanted to thank you for not coming back to make it easier for us. I think we needed to feel it." I read it once. Then again. I replied, "I hope you keep going." And that was it. No dramatic reunion. No tearful apology scene that wrapped everything up neatly. Just distance, clarity, and a new foundation. I thought about revenge one last time, about how people love stories where the wronged person gets loud justice, where the tables turn publicly and everyone claps. My revenge had been quiet. I walked away. I stopped being invisible. I let the consequences land where they belonged, and in doing so, I built a life that did not require my silence to function. If you are listening to this and you've spent years being the one who holds everything together, the one told you're strong because you don't complain, I want you to ask yourself something honestly. What would your life look like if you stopped disappearing? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to stay for more stories about family drama, betrayal, revenge, and the quiet power of choosing yourself, make sure you subscribe and stay here. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't a confrontation, it's walking forward and never shrinking again.